Hi, this is Miss Vernon with a reading of the short story Bargain written by A.B. Guthrie Jr. This short story is being read by the seventh grade students at Western Middle School. And so, in order to help those that cannot be in class when we are going through the story together, we're just going to go ahead and read this so that you guys can get the same kind of effect, even though you're not able to attend class at the same time. So, let's go ahead and get started because it's 11 pages long. In the late 19th century, Moondance, Montana was still 50 miles from the nearest railroad. That meant that even in good weather, it took freight carriers at least 2 days to bring supplies over the mountains to the town's two general stores. One of those stores Mr. Balmer owned, and it was Mr. Balmer who finally spotted a bargain that he couldn't pass up. Mr. Balmer and I had closed the Moondance Mercantile Company, and we were walking to the post office, and he had a bunch of bills in his hand ready to mail. There wasn't anyone or anything much on the street because it was supper time. A buckboard and a saddle horse were tied at Hirsch's rack, and a rancher in a wagon rattled for home ahead of us. The sound of his going faded out as he prodded his team. Freighter Slade stood alone in front of the Moondance saloon, maybe wondering whether to have one more before going to supper. People said he could hold a lot without showing it, except in being ornerier than usual. All right, I'm going to stop there for a second. In this paragraph, you notice that the word buckboard has a little number 1 next to it. So if you guys look down at the very bottom of the page, they have the definition for that. So buckboard is a light carriage. So when they're talking up here about a buckboard and a saddle horse, it means that there was a carriage and a saddle horse tied at the rack in front of the Hirsch's store. All right, when they start talking about Mr. Slade was wondering whether to have one more before going to supper, he's in front of the saloon, and the saloon is where you would go to get drinks. So he's debating on whether he wants to go in and get another drink before supper. Evidently, he drinks a lot, and sometimes when he drinks, he gets ornerier. So remember, this is one of our vocabulary words, so you should be able to figure out what that means happens when he drinks a lot. All right, let's keep going. Mr. Balmer didn't see him until he was almost on him, and then he stopped and fingered through the bills until he found the right one. He stepped up to Slade and held it out. Slade said, "What's this, Dutchy?" Mr. Balmer had to tilt his head up to talk to him. "You know what it is." Slade just said, "Yeah." You could never tell from his face what went on inside his skull. He had dark skin and shallow cheeks and a thick growing mustache that fell over the corners of his mouth. "It's a bill," Mr. Balmer said. "I tell you before it is a bill for $21.50. You know what I do with bills, don't you, Dutchy?" Slade asked. Mr. Balmer didn't answer the question. He said, "For merchandise." Slade took the envelope from Mr. Balmer's hand and squeezed it up in his fist and let it drop on the plank sidewalk. Not saying anything, he reached down and took Mr. Balmer's nose between the knuckles of his fingers and twisted it up into his eyes. That was all. That was all at the time. Slade half turned and slouched to the door of the bar and let himself in. Some men were laughing in there. Mr. Balmer stooped and picked up the bill and put it on top of the rest and smoothed it out for mailing. When he straightened up, I could see tears in his eyes from having his nose screwed around. He didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to him, being so much younger and feeling embarrassed for him. He went into the post office and slipped the bills into the slot, and we walked on home together. At the last, at the crossing where I had to leave him, he remembered to say, "Better study, Al. It's good to know to read and write and figure." I guess he felt he had to push me a little, my father being dead. I said, "Sure, see you after school tomorrow," which he knew I would anyway. I had been working in the store for him during the summer and after classes ever since pneumonia took my dad off. 3 of us worked there regularly. Mr. Balmer, of course, and me and Collie Coleman, who knew enough to drive the delivery wagon but wasn't much help around the store except for carrying orders out to the rigs at the hitch post and handling heavy things like the whiskey barrel at the back of the store, which Mr. Balmer sold quarts and gallons out of. The store carried quite a bit of stuff: sugar and flour and dried fruits and canned goods and such on one side, and yard goods and coats and caps and aprons and the like of that on the other, besides kerosene and bran and buckets and linoleum and pitchforks in the storehouse at the rear. But it wasn't a big store like Hirsch Brothers up the street. Ever would be, people guessed, going on to say with a sort of slow respect that it would have gone under long ago if Mr. Balmer hadn't been half mule and half beaver. He had started the store just 2 years before, and the way things were, worked himself close to death. He was at the high desk at the end of the grocery counter when I came in the next afternoon. He had an eye shade on and black sateen protectors on his forearm, and his pencil was in his hand instead of behind his ear. His glasses were roosted on the nose that Slade had twisted. He didn't hear me open and close the door or hear my feet as I walked back to him, and I saw he wasn't doing anything with the pencil but holding it over paper. I stood and studied him for a minute, seeing a small, stooped man with a little paunch bulging through his unbuttoned vest. He was a man you wouldn't remember from meeting once. There was nothing in his looks to set itself in your mind unless maybe it was his chin, which was a small pink hill in the gentle plane of his face. While I watched him, he lifted his hand and felt carefully of his nose. Then he saw me. His eyes had that kind of mistiness that seemed to go with age or illness, though he wasn't really old or sick either. He brought his hand down quickly and picked up the pencil, but he saw I still was looking at the nose, and finally he sighed and said, "That's Slade." Just the sound of the name of Slade brought Slade to my eye. I saw him slouched in front of the bar, and I saw him and his string coming down the grade from the buttes, the wheel horses held snug and the rest lined out pretty, and then the string leveling off and Slade's whip lifting hair from a horse that wasn't up in the collar. I had heard it said that Slade could make a horse scream with that whip. Slade's name wasn't Freighter, of course. Our town had nicknamed him that because that was what he was. All right, so I'm going to stop here and take a look at what these words mean. So we saw him coming down with his string from the grade, down the grade from the buttes, and then they talk about the wheel horses holding snug. So let's take a look at what those words mean. All right, so string is a team of horses. The bayous is a group of steep hills, and the wheel horses are the horses that are closest to the wheels. So if we look back up here, it says, I saw him slouched in front of the bar. I saw him and his string, so his group of horses, coming down the grade from the bayous, so from those steep hills. The wheel horses, the horses that are closest to the wheels, held snug and the rest lined out pretty. Then the group of horses leveled off and he was using his whip. Okay. All right, let's keep going. I don't think it's any good to send him a bill, Mr. Balmer, I said. He can't even read. He could pay yet. He don't pay anybody, I said. I think he hate me, Mr. Balmer went on. That is the thing. He hate me for coming not from this country. I come here 16 years old and learn to read and write, and I make a business, and so I think he hate me. He hates everybody, Mr. Balmer shook his head, but not to pinch the nose, not to call Dutchy. The side door squeaked open, but it was only Collie Coleman coming in from a trip. So I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Balmer, but you shouldn't have trusted him in the first place." "I know," he answered, looking at me with his misty eyes. "A man makes mistakes. I think some do not trust him, so he will pay me because I do. And I do not know him well then. He only came back to town 3-4 months ago from being away since before I go into business." "People who knew him before could have told you," I said. "A man make mistakes," he explained. "It's not my business, Mr. Balmer, but I would forget that bill." His eyes rested on my face for a long minute, as if they didn't see me, but the problem itself. He said, "It's not $21.50 now, Al. It's not that anymore. Well, what is it? He took a little time to answer. Then he brought his two hands up as if to help him shape the words. It is the thing. You see, it is the thing. I wasn't quite sure what he meant. He took his pencil from behind the ear where he had put it and studied the point of it. That Slade, he's still whiskey and call it evaporation. He sneaked things from his load. A thief he is, and too big for me. I said, I got no time for him, Mr. Balmer, but I guess there never was a freighter that didn't steal whiskey. That's what I hear. It was true, too. From the railroad to Moondance was 50 miles and a little better, a 2-day haul in good weather. Heck knew how long in bad. Any freight string bound home with a load had to lie out at least one night. When a freighter had his stock tended to and maybe a little fire going against the dark, he'd tackle a barrel of whiskey or of grain alcohol if he had one aboard, consigned to the Hirsch Brothers or Mr. Balmer's or the Moondance Saloon or the Gold Leaf Bar. He'd drive a hoop out of place, bore a little hole with a nail or bit, and draw off what he wanted. Then he'd plug the hole with a whittled peg and pound the hoop back. That was evaporation. Nobody complained much. With freighters, you generally took what they gave you within reason. More steals too, I told Mr. Balmer. More was Mr. Balmer's freighter. Yeah, he said, and that was all. But I stood there for a minute, thinking there might be something more. I could see thought swimming in his eyes above that little hill of a chin. Then a customer came in, and I had to go wait on him. Nothing happened for a month. Nothing between Mr. Balmer and Slade, that is. But fall drew on towards winter, and the first flight of ducks headed south, and Mr. Balmer hired Miss Lizzie Webb to help with the just beginning Christmas trade. And here it was, the first week in October, and he and I walked up the street again with the monthly bills. He always sent them out. I guess he had to. A bigger store like Hirsch's would wait on the ranchers until their beef or wool went to market. Up to a point, things looked and happened almost the same as they had before. So much the same that I had the crazy feeling I was going through that time again. There was a wagon and a rig tied up at Hirsch's rack, and a saddle horse standing hip shot in front of the harness shop. A few more people were on the street now, but not many, and lamps had been lit against the shortened day. It was dark enough that I didn't make out Slade right away. He was just a figure that came out of the yellow wash of light from the Moondance Saloon and stood on the boardwalk, and with his head made the little motion of spitting. Then I recognized the lean, raw shape of him and the muscles flowing down into the sloped shoulders. And in the settling darkness, I filled the picture in the dark skin and the flat cheeks and the peevish eyes and the mustache growing rank. There was Slade, and here was Mr. Balmer with his bills, and here I was, just as before, just like in the second go round of a bad dream. I felt like turning back, being embarrassed and half scared by trouble, even when it isn't mine. Please, I said to myself, don't stop, Mr. Balmer. Don't bite off anything. Please, short sighted the way you are, don't catch sight of him at all. I held up and stepped around Mr. Balmer and came up on the outside so as to be between him and Slade, where maybe I'd cut off his view. But it wasn't any use. All along, I think I knew it was no use. The praying or the walking between or anything. The act had to play itself out. Mr. Balmer looked across the front of me and saw Slade and hesitated in his step and came to a stop. Then, in his slow business way, his chin held firm against his mouth, he began fingering through the bills, squinting to make out the names. Slade had turned and was watching him, munching on a cud of tobacco like a bull waiting. You look, Al, Mr. Balmer said without lifting his face from the bills. I cannot see so good. So I looked, and while I was looking, Slade must have moved. The next thing I knew, Mr. Balmer was staggering ahead, the envelope spilling out of his hands. There had been a thump. The clap of a heavy hand swung hard on his back. Slade said, "How are you, Dutchy?" Mr. Balmer caught his balance and turned around. the bills he had trampled shining white between them, and at Slade's feet the hat that Mr. Balmer had stumbled out from under. Slade picked up the hat and scuffed through the bills and held it out. "Cold to be going without a sky piece," he said. Mr. Balmer hadn't spoken a word. The lamp shine from inside the bar caught his eyes, and in them, it seemed to me, a light came and went as anger and the uselessness of it took turns in his head. Two men had come up on us and stood watching. One of them was Angus MacDonald, who owned the Rancher's Bank, and the other was Dr. King. He had his bag in hand. Two others were drifting up, but I didn't have time to tell who. The light came in Mr. Balmer's eyes, and he took a step ahead and swung. I could have hit harder myself. The first landed on Slade's cheek without hardly so much as jogging his head, but it let hell loose in the man. I didn't know he could move so fast. He slid in like a practiced fighter and let Mr. Balmer have it full in the face. Mr. Balmer slammed over on his back, but he wasn't out. He started lifting himself. Slade leaped ahead and brought a boot heel down on the hand he was lifting himself by. I heard meat and bone under that heel and saw Mr. Balmer fall back and try to roll away. Things had happened so fast that not until then did anyone have a chance to get between them. Now Mr. MacDonald pushed at Slade's chest, saying, "That's enough, freighter, that's enough now." And Dr. King lined up too, and another man didn't know, and I took a place, and we formed a kind of screen between them. Dr. King turned and bent to look at Mr. Balmer. "Fool hit me first," Slade said. "That's enough," Mr. MacDonald told him again, while Slade looked at all of us as if he'd spit on us for a nickel. Mr. MacDonald went on, using a half-friendly tone, and I knew it was because he didn't want to take Slade on any more than the rest of us did. "You go on home and sleep it off, freighter. That's the ticket." Slade just snorted. From behind us, Dr. King said, "I think you've broken this man's hand." "Lucky for him I didn't kill him," Slade answered. "Dutch penny pincher." He fingered the chew out of his mouth. "Maybe he'll know enough to leave me alone now." Dr. King had Mr. Balmer on his feet. "I'll take him to the office," he said. Blood was draining from Mr. Balmer's nose and rounding the curve of his lip and dripping from the sides of his chin. He held his hurt right hand in the other, but a thing was that he didn't look beaten even then, not the way a man who has given up looks beaten. Maybe that was why Slade said with a show of that fierce anger, "You stay away from me here, stay clear away, or you'll get more of the same." Dr. King led Mr. Balmer away. Slade went back into the bar, and the other men walked off, talking about the fight. I got down and picked up the bills because I knew Mr. Balmer would want me to, and I mailed them at the post office, dirty as they were. It made me sore some way that Slade's bill was one of the few that wasn't marked up. The cleanness of it seemed to say that there was no getting the best of him. Mr. Balmer had his hand in a sling the next day and wasn't much good at waiting on the trade. I had to hustle all afternoon and so didn't have a chance to talk to him even if he had wanted to talk. Mostly he stood at his desk, and once passing it, I saw he was practicing writing with his left hand. His nose and the edges of his cheeks around it were swollen some. At closing time, I said, "Look, Mr. Balmer, I can lay out of school a few days until you get straightened out here." "No," he answered, as if to wave the subject away. "I get somebody else. You go to school. It's good to learn." I had half a notion to say that learning hadn't helped him with Slade. Instead, I blurted out that I would have the law on Slade. "The law?" he asked. "The sheriff or somebody." "No, Al," he said, "you would not." I asked why. "The law is not for plain fights," he said. "Shooting, robbing, yes, the law come quick. The plain fights, there are too many. They not count enough." He was right, I said. "I'd do something anyhow." "Yes," he answered with a slow nod of his head. "Something you would do, Al." He didn't tell me what. Within a couple of days, he got another man to clerk for him. It was Ed Hempel, who was always finding and losing jobs, and we made out. Mr. Balmer took his hand from the sling in a couple or 3 weeks, but with the tape on it, it still wasn't any use to him. From what you could see of the fingers below the tape, it looked like it never would be. He spent most of the time at the high desk, sending me or Ed out on the errands he used to run, like posting and getting the mail. Sometimes I wondered if that was because he was afraid of meeting Slade. He could just as well have gone himself. He wasted a lot of hours just looking at nothing, though I will have to say he worked hard at learning to write left handed. Then, a month and a half before Christmas, he hired Slade to haul his freight for him. Ed Hempel told me about the deal when I showed up for work. Yes, sir, he said, resting his foot on a crate in the storeroom where we were supposed to be working. I tell you, he's throwed in with Slade. Told me this morning to go out and locate him if I could and bring him in. Slade was at the saloon, of course. I told him this was business, like Balmer had told me to, and there was a quart of whiskey right there in the store for him if he'd come and get it. He was out of money, I reckon, because the quart fetched him. What did they say? I asked him. Search me. There was 2 or 3 people in the store, and Balmer told me to wait on them, and he and Slade palavered back at the desk. How do you know they made a deal? Ed spread his hands out. About noon, Moore came in with his string, and I heard Balmer say he was making a change. Moore didn't like it too good either. It was a hard thing to believe, but there one day was Slade with a pile of stuff for the Moondance Mercantile Company, and that was proof enough, with something left for boot. Mr. Balmer never opened the subject up with me, though I gave him plenty of chances, and I didn't feel like asking. He didn't talk much these days, but went around absent-minded, feeling now and then of the fingers that curled yellow and stiff out of the bandage like the toes on the leg of a dead chicken. Even on our walks home, he kept his thoughts to himself. I felt different about him now and was sore inside. Not that I blamed him exactly. 135 pounds wasn't much to throw against 200, and who could tell what Slade would do on a belly full of whiskey? He had promised Mr. Balmer more of the same, hadn't he? But it didn't feel good. I couldn't look up to Mr. Balmer like I used to, and still wanted to. I didn't have the beginning of an answer when men cracked jokes or shook their heads in sympathy with Mr. Balmer, saying Slade had made him come to time. Slade hauled in a load for the store and another, and Christmas time was drawing on and trade was heavy. The winter had started early, then pulled back and came on again. There was a blizzard and afterwards a sunshine that was ice shine on the snowdrift. I was glad to be busy selling overshoes and sheep-lined coats and mittens and socks as thick as saddle blankets, and Christmas candy out of the buckets, and hickory nuts and the fresh oranges that the people in our town never saw except when Santa Claus was coming. One afternoon, when I lit out from the class, the thermometer on the school porch read 42 below, but you didn't have to look at it to know how cold the weather was. Your nose and fingers and toes and ears and the bones inside you could tell you. The snow cried when you stepped on it. I got to the store and took my things off and scuffed my hands at the stove for a minute, so as to get life enough in them to tie a parcel. Mr. Balmer, he was always polite to me, said, Hello, Al. Not so much to do today. Too cold for customers. He shuddered a little as if he hadn't gotten the chill off yet and rubbed his broken hand with the good one. We need Christmas goods, he said, looking at out the window to the furrows of the wheels had made in the snow-banked streets. And I knew he was thinking of Slade's string inbound from the railroad and the time it might take even Slade to travel those hard miles. Slade never made it at all. Less than an hour later, our old freighter, Moore, came in, his beard white and stiff with frost. He didn't speak at first, but looked around and clumped to the stove and took off his heavy mittens, holding his news inside him. Then he said, not pleasantly, Your new man's dead, Balmer. My new man, Mr. Balmer said. Who do you think? Slade, he's dead. All Mr. Balmer could say was, Dead? Froze to death, I figured. Moore told him while Collie Coleman and Ed Hempel and Miss Lizzie and I and a couple of customers stepped closer. Not Slade, Mr. Balmer said. He knew too much to freeze. Maybe so, but he sure froze now. I got him in the wagon. We started looking at one another and at Moore. Moore, who was enjoying his news, enjoying feeding it out bit by bit so as to hold the stage. Heart might have give out for all I know. The side door swung open, letting in a cloud of cold and 3 men who stood like us waiting on Moore. I moved a little and looked through the window and saw Slade's freight outfit tied outside with more men around it. Two of them were on a wheel of one of the wagons looking inside. Had an extra man, so I brought your stuff in, Morse went on. Figured you'd be glad to pay for it. Not Slade, Mr. Balmer said again. You can take a look at him. Mr. Balmer answered no. Someone's taken word to Connor to bring his hearse. Anyhow, I told him to. I carted old Slade this far, but Connor can have him now. Moore put on his mitts, found him there by the Deep Creek crossing, doubled up in the snow and his fire out. He moved towards the door. I'll see to the horses, but your stuff will have to sit there. I got more than enough work to do with the hearses. Mr. Balmer just nodded. I put on my coat and went out and waited my turn and climbed on a wagon wheel and looked inside. And there was Slade, piled on some bags of bran. Maybe because of being frozen, his face was whiter than I ever saw it. Whiter and deader, too, though it never had been lively. Only the mustache seemed still alive, sprouting thick like greasewood from alkali. Slade was doubled up, all right, as if he had died and stiffened leaning forward in a chair. I got down from the wheel, and Collie and then Ed climbed up. Moore was unhitching, tossing off his pieces of information while he did so. Pretty soon Mr. Connor came up with his old hearse, and he and Moore tumbled Slade into it, and the team that was as old as the hearse made of, the tires squeaking in the snow. The people trailed on away with it, their breaths leaving little ribbons of mist in the air. It was beginning to get dark. Mr. Balmer came out of the side door of the store, bundled up, and called to Collie and Ed and me. We unload, he said. Already is late, Al. You better get a couple lanterns now. We did a fast job setting the stuff out of the wagons onto the platform and then carrying it or rolling it on the one truck that the store owned and stowing it inside according to where Mr. Balmer's good hand pointed. A barrel was one of the last things to go in. I edged it up and Collie nosed the truck under it and I let it fall back. Mr. Balmer, I said, we'll never sell all of this, will we? Yeah, he answered. Sure we sell it. I get it cheap. A bargain, Al, so I buy it. I looked at the barrel head again. There in big letters I saw wood alcohol, deadly poison. Hurry now, Mr. Balmer said. Is late. For a flash, and no longer, I saw through the mist in his eyes. Saw, you might say, that hilly chin repeated there. Then you go home, Al. It's good to know how to read. All right, I know that was long. You can stop the story. You can go back to parts that you didn't have, but that is the story. We will be talking another day about what the story means, answering those questions, and going through that. But for now, that is the story of Bargain, the short story Bargain by A.B. Guthrie Jr.